The following announcement has been paid for by the New World Order. So welcome back, everybody. This is the second part of my Nitro retrospective, where I'm doing a series. I'm currently in the midst of rewatching WCW Monday Nitro, starting with the beginning episode in 1995, all the way to the Finger Poke of Doom in first episode of 1999, I believe. That is the period I've decided to rewatch, revisit, and experience all over again, and kind of relive all those great nostalgic feelings. Part 1 covered the period from the very first episode all the way to May 1996, which is what I deem the pre-nWo era. And this video is going to be centered on the May 27th, 1996 episode all the way to the end of the year. And that, to me, encompasses like the growth period and the initial evolution of the New World Order, the nWo, one of the greatest concepts ever conceived in the history of professional wrestling. I've had this shirt, by the way. This is the same nWo shirt I had when I was 12 years old. I was a big kid, so I never fully outgrew this thing. And it's something that I have a lot of fond memories of. And this was a period when I decided I was going to go back and rewatch Nitro. This is a period I was really excited to experience again, because as I said in the last video I did, that early period, there's a lot of promise there, but WCW didn't quite reach any kind of creative highs. There were some good things in the shows. There was some, like I said, there was plenty of promise. It was well produced, looked great, but they needed to find an identity and a direction. That was something they clearly didn't have, because they were still doing Hulk Hogan and his buddies versus Ric Flair in the Dungeon of Doom, and that is not something to build a company around. But again, there were some promise there. You know, I liked the Giant in those early episodes. The Four Horsemen, this version of it, was the most entertaining part of the early part of Monday Nitro, but here we are now. Starting with May 27th, 1996, we get two important elements that contributed to the evolution of WCW Nitro. One was the expansion to 2 hours. And once that happened, it made Nitro feel even bigger than it had before. Because, 1 hour show is great. And I think there's benefits to a 1 hour show in the sense that, it's easier to leave people wanting more if you're only an hour long. And it's harder to get overexposed and certain guys to get overexposed. And I think the 2 hour format, it kind of opens the door to kind of those negative things. But the move to 2 hours was really big for WCW at that point. It showed, okay, the show's growing, and they're getting some momentum here, and things are happening. And also on this show, the big thing that everybody remembers and everybody talks about is the debut of Scott Hall. And the way they handled his debut is unlike how modern wrestling companies handle debuts now, because you either get loads of vignettes to hype up somebody's arrival, or you get something, if it's a surprise, they're setting it up for a big pop. Like, they want the music to hit and people to react to it, or they want, him to show up in the middle of something big and significant so that the most eyeballs are watching it. Going back and rewatching this, Scott Hall's debut was remarkably underplayed. He showed up in the middle of a match between two nobodies that nobody really cared about, and he just randomly came out through the crowd, no music, no fanfare, no nothing, and it felt more organic and natural that way, because it felt like it caught everybody off guard. Wait, what's happening right now? It was an amazing, change the channel type moment, where I could imagine if social media was around back then, and you're watching WWF Raw, and all of a sudden it's like, holy shit, Scott Hall just showed up on WCW, and everybody would immediately flip over. It's one of those, but again, it was done with such in an understated way, because it was the first chapter of the story that they were trying to tell. And that was the aspect I loved about the evolution of the nWo, and I really got to experience it all over again and really appreciate all the steps that they took in the story to get to that point, because I have a feeling if they were doing the story today, more so WWE, they would have Scott Hall come out 1 week, then 2 weeks, then 3 weeks in a row, then 4 weeks in a row, with no real change or evolution. We'd all be like, okay, what's going on? But here, they had Scott Hall come out, said that more people are coming. And then that leads into the Great American Bash, where Kevin Nash shows up and they powerbomb Eric Bischoff through the stage. And then that leads to, we have a third man. And then that leads into the match being signed for Bash at the Beach, and then WCW trying to get guys together. to fight them. And then that, of course, leads to the Bash of the Beach, where Hogan is revealed as the third man, which to this day, I rank up there. It's got to be one of, if not the greatest heel turn of all time. And then that was like, holy shit, Hogan's a heel. And that took it even further. And then you started to see the evolution of like the clothes and the look, like that Hogan was wearing all black, but you didn't have the nWo logo fully designed yet. And then they did the first vignette. This announcement has been paid for by the New World Order, which I looked forward to those every Nitro. That was probably the main reason I tuned in, at least during that period. I wanted those like nWo announcements, because that was what I found to be the most interesting. Because the nWo could have easily turned into kind of like the Four Horsemen of the 90s. And not bad, but just another wrestling stable. But the stuff that they did with it, the way the segments were produced and the way that the characters were handled and the way they built up everything, it's like, this is something completely different. Because then, okay, once Hogan shows up, then it became Hogan wants the title. And you get the match at Hog Wild 96, where he beats Giant for the title. And he spray paints the title, which that was big. It was like, oh my God, what is happening right now? It was just, they were breaking all the rules, and they were just crafting something that was really special and unique. And I mean, one of the most unforgettable episodes in Monday Nitro is the one where Kevin Nash and Scott Hall just went through a tear and were just attacking people in the locker room. And it felt like such a massive attack, with him, Nash throwing Rey Mysterio face first like a lawn dart into the production truck, and Savage hanging off of the car as they were driving away, and Jimmy Hart coming out and telling people that the New World Order was attacking backstage and everybody needs to come back and help. And that really long segment where it was just them reacting to all the attacks, where people were being taken to the hospital and everything. It felt like they ruined the show. Like something really horrible happened that stopped the show dead in its tracks. And it felt so believable, and was so well done. And it really helped catapult the nWo into like that epic category. It really did feel like a separate entity from WCW, and it really did feel like a legitimate invasion. And for the revolution, more and more people were added to it. We saw the Giant be the first one to turn against WCW, the first WCW guy to join the nWo. And we saw Ted DiBiase get added to the mix as a financial backer. Then we saw Six show up, the 1, 2, 3 Kid, and it felt like, oh my God, they just keep growing and growing. And, flyers would fall down from the ceiling. You'd have people with signs going through the crowd and promoting the nWo. Then they would start like hijacking the announce booth and forcing the announcers away, which that started like a 1.5 year long build up to Larry Zbyszko and Eric Bischoff at Starrcade 97, but I'll get there when I get there. And the reason WCW couldn't mobilize against these guys is because they had their own personal problems against each other that they were dealing with, and they just could not get on the same page. The Four Horsemen and the Dungeon of Doom were in the middle of a feud, and they hated each other. And which, by the way, it never ceases to amaze me that the Dungeon of Doom and the Four Horsemen and the nWo all existed at the same time. That is just weird to me, because all three of those factions feel like they come from completely different eras. Like, Horsemen reeks of late 80s. The Dungeon of Doom reeks of cartoony bullshit era of the early to mid 90s. And the nWo just exemplifies like that cool, badass late 90s period. But there was a point where they all existed at the same time, which I think is really fascinating. This is also where we saw Mongo McMichaels leave the booth and join the Four Horsemen. I'll have more to say about Mongo in a future video, but what that did was greatly improve the commentary, and because he was terrible at the booth. But we were getting like the voices of Monday Nitro in place, especially when they went to 2 hours, and you'd have Bobby the Brain Heenan in hour 2 and Larry Zbyszko in hour 1. And then eventually we got Tony Schiavone, who would ultimately, to me, become the voice of WCW. You had Eric Bischoff for most of the rest of the year, until it was revealed by Roddy Piper that he was one of the ones that was leading the nWo all along, and that whole conspiracy bit. The announce booth started to take shape, and the war with the nWo really started to take shape. And this is when, to me, when WCW really took control of the war, and it was like, oh boy, they're here to fight, and they're delivering the coolest wrestling out there right now. And if you look up and down the show, not just the nWo stuff, but you also had the Cruiserweight division was starting to come on strong with Rey Mysterio and Dean Malenko having their series of matches. And they're a pairing that I saw have a ton of matches with each other, but they always delivered, so I can't really complain all that much. All of their matches were very, very good. Eddie Guerrero was starting to come into his own, although wasn't quite there yet. Babyface Eddie is like, a little bit milquetoast. It wasn't until he turned heel in 97 that you really got to see Eddie Guerrero develop into something special. And Chris Jericho would show up at this point in time, but he was the whitest of the white meat baby faces, and it wouldn't be until about 98 where you really saw the true Chris Jericho come out. But he showed up during this period as well, and that's always fascinating to go back and see the really young guys that would become legends, like start their roads to success and their big evolutions. Chris Benoit was a member of the Horsemen at this point. And you also got to see kind of the early stages of Diamond Dallas Page evolving into something special. And that wouldn't really take shape until 97. But he was starting to get the Diamond Cutter over. It was becoming one of the hottest finishers in wrestling. But despite all of that and the amount of talent that WCW had, they just couldn't get on the same page because they had all their own personal BS problems against each other, whether it be Ray and Malenko in the Cruiserweight division, or Eddie and DDP having their feud, or the Four Horsemen in the Dungeon of Doom at each other's throats, and even Sting and Lex Luger, who were friends, they started to have problems as there were issues with trusting Sting, as it was believed that he had joined the nWo, and that started Sting down his path of becoming the ultimate savior of WCW with the Crow gimmick. But again, we'll have more to say about that in 1997. And it wasn't until Roddy Piper showed up that there was any hope for WCW, because it was just the nWo on a tear the entire time. Randy Savage looked like he might be one of the big heroes, but that ultimately fell apart when Miss Elizabeth joined the nWo, and Savage ultimately got blacklisted from WCW, which would lead to him going to the dark side in 1997 at Super Brawl. But again, I'll comment on that when we get there. But WCW looked like it was in complete disarray, and it needed to change with the times if they were going to have any shot at stopping the nWo, which of course, 97, all the heroes would start showing up. And, Luger started to get out of his creative funk at this point. He was, prior to the nWo, he was kind of in this phase where it's like, is he a heel with the Dungeon of Doom? Is he going to betray Sting, or can Sting trust him, or whatever? And it was kind of a mess the way they were handling that. So by this point with the nWo, I think they were able to force Luger into full-on babyface mode, and I think that worked great for him. And I'll have a lot more to say about Luger when we talk about 1997. There are a few guys in 1997 that I'm really looking forward to that period too, because that's when all the WCW good guys really started to step up, and I'm very excited to talk about that era. But for right now, this is all nWo here, and watching the stages in the development of the nWo. And not all of it was good. You did get that one episode where the nWo completely took over the show, and it just felt like a confusing mess. They did a bit with the Nasty Boys trying to join the nWo, which was okay, and it kind of made sense since it was known that Hogan was friends with them. But that ultimately didn't really go anywhere. But overall, the nWo just captured the imagination of wrestling fans everywhere. And we're still, to this day, we are still talking about the nWo and how revolutionary it was and how amazing it all was. And it made for great wrestling television. And it was what pushed the WCW ahead of the WWF in the Monday Night Wars. And it was the real catalyst for that. Because, I'm a believer of this. If you want a great story, you need a great villain, threat, whatever, for the heroes to ultimately overcome. And we got that with the nWo in spades. And man, Hogan, goddamn do I hate that guy. Rewatching these episodes, I'm like, man, fuck that guy. He's a piece of shit. And I'm saying this while I'm wearing an nWo t-shirt, but, Hall and Nash and Six-Pac as well, they were kind of the cool heels. They're like, the streetwise punks that were kind of funny, and they were cool, and they were the ones that shilled the merchandise and everything and cracked the jokes. So they were kind of cool, but Hogan, it was like, oh, fuck that guy. He's a piece of shit. And the amount of heat he could get was nuclear. And it only got amplified when Eric Bischoff kind of became his corner man, and you wanted to punch Eric Bischoff right in the fucking face. And but I love that. I love when you can get somebody, when you can get me to really hate somebody. That makes it all the better, I think. And I think they did an amazing job. And Hogan played the part well, to his credit. I mean, I hated that guy. If you can get that kind of attitude out of me, you are really doing your job. So I highly recommend checking out this period of Monday Nitro. Again, it's from May 27th, 1996, all the way to the end of the year, because it's like you really get the full evolution of the nWo growing into this powerful force that would almost destroy WCW. And you started to get the seeds planted for all the heroes that would show up in 1997. Because right now, it was like, the only hopes they had were Randy Savage, and that didn't work out, and Roddy Piper, who wouldn't fully commit to WCW in storyline at that point. He would ultimately become a authority figure in the company as his feud with Hogan would continue. But there's plenty more good stuff coming in 1997, but it's clear as day that the nWo, if you want like the story of the nWo and how it got started, these early episodes of Nitro come highly recommended from me. And it was a blast reliving all of that stuff. So, like I did with part 1, I'm going to list a best episode, best match, and an MVP for this period. So let's start with MVP. Obviously, I'm going to give it to the nWo. Just the entire faction of the nWo. Like I said, they were the catalyst of the storyline direction of WCW and putting Monday Nitro on the map. So the nWo, Hogan, Hall, Nash, and even, Six, DiBiase, The Giant, Scott Norton, Eric Bischoff, those guys. It was something that kind of took on a life of its own and became bigger than the business it was representing. It was kind of, the nWo, I mean, it was something that caught on like wildfire. And there are other guys that delivered during this period, like Sting and DDP and Luger and Malenko and Ray, like I said before. But the nWo, they were the real draw of WCW during this time and really just reinvented how we thought about wrestling television. Best match, I'm going to give it to Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero in a U.S. title tournament semifinals match. This was on the December 23rd episode in 1996. Just a great indicator of just two amazing workers that worked with each other a lot. And as we all know, they were really good friends. And unfortunately, neither one is no longer with us. But if you want to see Benoit and Eddie at like a younger stage in their career, pre-WWE, and just see how good they were, even before getting to the WWE, and how well they worked with each other, I think that match is a great indicator of it. But my favorite episode is going to go to the September 9th episode, 1996. This is the go-home show before Fall Brawl, where Sting's loyalties were really called into question as Sting attacked Lex Luger, and it looked like WCW was just screwed heading into the War Games match. And as we ultimately found out, it was a fake Sting the entire time. The fake Sting, which they got some mileage out of throughout the Sting angle, as Sting would just, that was one of the most satisfying parts. But I'll get there in 97 when Crow Sting beat the crap out of the fake Sting. But we were introduced to the fake Sting as he kind of caused WCW to lose faith in Sting, and that would start Sting's whole journey. But that episode I thought was very, very good. Because we also got a hell of a great promo from Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen leading into War Games as well. So I highly recommend checking that out. So that was, of all the episodes, that was my favorite one from a storyline perspective and pushing the story, especially setting up the fake Sting and really getting Sting rolling as the character he would ultimately become. So that concludes this video. Basically, the nWo was awesome. A lot of what they did in 1996 was awesome, and it was a great starting point for what was to come in 1997. So next time I do one of these Nitro retrospectives, we will cover the first half of 1997, and we will focus specifically on the heroes of WCW and who would step up to the plate to face the nWo. But that is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I will see you all later.